Good afternoon everyone, my name is Shae-Lee and this is our stock pitch presentation on Kathmandu Holdings Limited and Premier Investments Limited. These are their logos and here are our group members. So as I said, my name is Shae-Lee, we've got Sebastian Price, Oliver Brown and Dermot Fitzgerald. The main characters and setting. So for Kathmandu Holdings Limited, they're a major industry provider in the hiking and outdoor equipment stores in Australia industry, as well as the sport and camping equipment retailing industry. Their board of directors includes Michael Daly, their Group Chief Executive Officer and Managing Director, David Kirk, the Non-Executive Chairman, and then they have Philip Bowman, John Harvey, Andrea Martins and Brent Scrimshaw, who serve as Non-Executive Directors. Premier Investments Limited is a major industry provider in the stationery goods retailing in Australia industry, as well as the women's wear stores in Australia industry. Their board of directors includes Mark McInnes, their Chief Operating Officer, Solomon Liu, their Chairman, David Crean, their Non-Executive Deputy Chairman, and then they have Michael McLeod, Henry Lanza, Timothy Antoine, Sally Herman, Sylvia Falzone and Terence McCartney, all as Non-Executive Directors.
For our investment thesis, as of the 24th of May 2022, on assets, KMD Brands had a stock price value of $1.03, compared to Premier Investments, which had a $22.05 value. Kathmandu has a market value of $928 million, whilst Premier Investments has a market value of $4.263 billion. Kathmandu Holdings has two subsidiary companies, Oboz and Rip Curl. And Premier Investments has multiple subsidiary companies, the Just Group, Smiggle, Portman's, Just Jeans, Peter Alexander, JJ's, Jackie E and Dottie. In terms of business visions, Kathmandu, especially after the pandemic, is looking to put more focus into aligning its future business intentions with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, rather than the interests of the future earnings of stakeholders and shareholders. For Premier Investments, their mission statement is to aspire and deliver sustainable value through the effective use of resources and relationships. To help drive future earnings, Premier Investments is pleased to make major investments in its people, its information technology, digital marketing capability, and distribution centres to maximise increasing customer preference to online shopping.
In relation to the key value drivers for Kathmandu Holdings Limited, their internal drivers are our people, our communities, science-based climate action, circular business models, and courageous, joyful and open. Externally, they're affected by real household discretionary income, sport participation, the consumer sentiment index, the average weekly hours worked, the trade-weighted index, and the demand from online shopping. Premier Investments Limited internally is affected by our commitment to our people, attraction and retention, development, reward and recognition, workplace safety, people, community, environment and ethical sourcing. Externally, they're affected by real household disposable income, the customer sentiment index, female population aged 18 and over, the demand from both department stores and online shopping, IT and telecommunications adoption, business confidence index, and the public concern over environmental issues. The red flags for Kathmandu Holdings Limited include low profit versus sector average, high product service concentration, low to steady barriers to entry, low to steady level of assistance, high competition, low revenue per employee. Threats include low revenue growth from 2021 to 2026, low performance drivers, and the consumer sentiment index is a threat as much as a value driver. For Premier Investments Limited, red flags include low steady barriers to entry, none to steady levels of assistance, high competition, low profit versus the average sector, high customer class concentration, low revenue per employee. For threats, this includes low revenue growth for 2017 to 2022, 2021 to 2026, and 2022 to 2017, as well as the IT and telecommunications adoption, which is also a threat as well as a red flag. So the best case scenario for Kathmandu Holdings and for Premier Investments Limited are listed here. We have predicted that their growth rate will be 25% with a probability of 28 for Kathmandu, as well as a growth rate of 45% and a probability of 18% for Premier Investments. We have calculated a best case, a base case, and a worst case scenario for each of these companies over a short term of 5-year growth. Lower growth for Kathmandu with a higher probability rate equals high probability, low risk investment. The EPS indicates minimal growth over 5 years. Potential risks such as COVID-19 and digital innovation were considered. Sustainability was improved. EPS does not favour Kathmandu in this scenario, even though they have a higher probability than Premier Investments on predicted growth rate. And our predicted earnings per share after abnormalities for the 2026 year is $10.42. For Premier Investments, they have a higher growth rate with a lower probability rate, so low probability equals high risk investment. EPS indicates high growth over 5 years. Potential risks with low probability mean that they are impacted more by risk and they need to consider digital innovation. EPS favours the Premier Investments in this scenario, even though they have a lower probability than Kathmandu on predicted growth rate. And their projected earnings per share after abnormalities for the 2026 year is $247.06. For the best case scenario, we would recommend that the Kathmandu investment is the most likely situation to eventuate.
For the base case, Kathmandu has a growth rate of 12% and a probability of 67% compared to Premier Investments' growth rate of 14.28% and probability of 15%. For Kathmandu, it has a lesser growth but with a higher confidence. This means that a lower risk is a safer investment. EPS indicates consistent improvements over time, therefore there is a greater confidence for short-term investments with a lesser risk. Higher probability than Premier Investments Limited on predicted growth rate. The predicted EPS after abnormalities has been calculated over a potential 5-year period at $9.34. To invest in Kathmandu Holdings Limited, where the base case is the expected outcome, it is the most likely scenario to eventuate. For Premier Investments, it has a higher growth but substantially lower confidence. That means that it's a high risk, high reward investment. It has a marginally higher predicted growth rate, which means investing for a slight bonus at such a low probability is not wise. The predicted EPS after abnormalities has been calculated for a 5-year period at $194.72. To invest in Premier Investments Limited, where the base case is the expected outcome, it is the least likely scenario to eventuate on the probability alone. This does not consider potential red flags in the worst case and the best case scenarios that may skew the respective growth rate probabilities.
For our worst case scenario, Kathmandu has a growth rate of 5% and a probability of 5% as well. Premier Investments has a growth rate of 2% and a much higher probability of 40%. So this is the net debt to cash flow ratio chart. So we use this because we believe the course of the worst case scenarios would be the result of unpaid accumulated debt. We can see that in Kathmandu, with the exception of the pandemic, has consistently maintained a relatively healthy and sustainable ratio of long-term debt to yearly cash flow rates. This is unlike Premier Investments, where we can see in the last 10 years the company only managed to reach a positive ratio once in 2017.
For the resolution, Kathmandu Holdings Limited, if this stock is chosen, it is recommended to follow the base case scenario. Base case scenario is the most likely to happen. It has the highest probability of occurring. The base case scenario provides substantial yield with preferential confidence level. 12% growth with 67% confidence level will yield $1 stock price increase from $8.34 to $9.34. Premier Investments, if this stock is chosen, it's recommended to follow the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario is the most likely to eventuate. It has the highest probability of occurring. The worst case scenario provides minimal yield with the highest confidence level. 2% growth with 40% confidence will yield $3.41 stock price increase from $170.39 to $173.80. This investment in the stock should be made under the assumption that this percentage growth will occur.
So this is the free cash flow using operating revenue graph. This shows us extrapolating the graph of the free cash flow to shareholders for Kathmandu and Premier Investments. These are the discount rates for Kathmandu and Premier Investments. Because of Premier Investments' higher discount rate, it has a lower present value of future cash flows. As a group, our recommendation in conclusion, we would recommend Kathmandu as a best investing opportunity. Although Premier Investments has a higher future expected growth rate, as seen in the financial statement in previous years, the company's free cash flow rate is incredibly volatile, unlike Kathmandu, which has had a much more predictable future earnings. Because of this, for a more conservative and defensive investment proposition, we would advise storing your money in a more financially stable company. Thank you.